Commentary. Lines 1 through 4, I was the shadow of the waxwing slain, etc. The image in these opening lines evidently refers to a bird knocking itself out in full flight against the outer surface of a glass pane in which a mirrored sky, with its slightly darker tint and slightly slower cloud, presents the illusion of continued space. We can visualize John Shade in his early boyhood, a physically unattractive but otherwise beautifully developed lad, experiencing his first eschatological shock as, with incredulous fingers, he picks up from the turf that compact ovoid body and gazes at the wax-red streaks ornamenting those gray-brown wings, and at the graceful tail feathers tipped with yellow as bright as fresh paint. When in the last year of Shade's life I had the fortune of being his neighbor in the idyllic hills of New Y, see forward, I often saw those particular birds most convivially feeding on the chalk blue berries of junipers growing at the corner of his house. See also lines 181 to 182. My knowledge of garden aves had been limited to those of northern Europe by a young New Y gardener, in whom I was interested. See note to line 998. Helped me to identify the profiles of quite a number of tropical-looking little strangers and their comical calls, and naturally, every treetop plotted its dotted line toward the ornithological work on my desk, to which I would gallop from the lawn in the nomenclatorial agitation. How hard I found to fit the name Robin to the suburban impostor, the gross fowl with its untidy, dull red livery, and the revolting gusto it showed when consuming long, sad, passive worms. Incidentally, it is curious to note that a crested bird called in Zemblin Sampel, silktail, closely resembling a waxwing in shape and shade, is the model of one of the three heraldic creatures, the other two being respectively a reindeer proper and a merman-azure, crined, or in the armorial bearings of the Zemblin king, Charles the Beloved, born 1915, whose glorious misfortunes I discussed so often with my friend. The poem was begun at the dead center of the year, a few minutes after midnight, July 1st, while I played chess with a young Iranian enrolled in our summer school, and I do not doubt that our poet would have understood his annotator's temptation to synchronize a certain fateful fact, the departure from Zembla of the would-be regicide Gradus, with that date. Actually, Gradus left Onhava on the Copenhagen plane on July 5th. Line 12, that crystal land, perhaps an allusion to Zembla, my dear country. After this, in the disjointed, half-obliterated draft, which I am not at all sure I have deciphered properly, quote, I must not forget to say something that my friend told me of a certain king. Alas, he would have said a great deal more if a domestic anti-Carlist had not controlled every line he communicated to her. Many a time have I rebuked him in bantering fashion. You really should promise to use all that wonderful stuff, you bad gray poet, you. And we would both giggle like boys. But then after the inspiring evening stroll, we had to part, and grim night lifted the drawbridge between his impregnable fortress and my humble home. That king's reign, 1936 to 1958, will be remembered by at least a few discerning historians as a peaceful and elegant one. Owing to a fluid system of judicious alliances, Mars in his time never marred the record. Internally, until corruption, betrayal, and extremism penetrated it, the People's Place, Parliament, worked in perfect harmony with the Royal Council. Harmony, indeed, was the reign's password. The polite arts and pure sciences flourished. Technology, applied physics, industrial chemistry, and so forth were suffered to thrive. A small skyscraper of ultramarine glass was steadily rising in Onhava. The climate seemed to be improving. Taxation had become a thing of beauty. The poor were getting a little richer and the rich a little poorer, in accordance with what may be known someday as Kinbote's Law. Medical care was spreading to the confines of the state, less and less often on his tour of the country, every autumn when the rowans hung coral-heavy and the puddles tinkled with Muscovy glass. the friendly and eloquent monarch would be interrupted by a pertussal backdracht in a crowd of school children. Parachuting had become a popular sport. Everybody, in a word, was content. Even the political mischief makers who were contentedly making mischief paid by a contented Sosed, Zembla's gigantic neighbor. But let us not pursue this tiresome subject. To return to the king, take for instance the question of personal culture. How often is it that kings engage in some special research? Conchologists among them can be counted on the fingers of one maimed hand. The last king of Zembla, partly under the influence of his uncle Conmal, the great translator of Shakespeare, see notes to lines 39 to 40 and 962, had become, despite frequent migraines, passionately addicted to the study of literature. At 40, not long before the collapse of his throne, he had attained such a degree of scholarship that he dared accede to his venerable uncle's raucous, dying request. Teach, Carlick! Of course, it would have been unseemly for a monarch to appear in the robes of learning at a university lectern and present to rosy youth Finnegan's Wake as a monstrous extension of Angus Maidiarmid's incoherent transactions and of Southey's lingo grand, dear Stumperumper, etc., or discuss the Zemblan variants collected in 1798 by Hodensky of the Kongskuggseo, the Royal Mirror, an anonymous masterpiece of the 12th century. Therefore, he lectured under an assumed name and in a heavy makeup, with wig and false whiskers. All brown-bearded, apple-cheeked, blue-eyed Zemblans look alike, and I, who have not shaved now for a year, resemble my disguised king. See also note to line 894. During these periods of teaching, Charles Xavier made it a rule to sleep at a pied-à-terre he had rented, as any scholarly citizen would, in Coriolanus Lane, a charming, central-heated studio with adjacent bathroom and kitchenette. One recalls with nostalgic pleasure its light gray carpeting and pearl gray walls, one of them graced with a solitary copy of Picasso's Chandelier, Poe et Casserole Emmêlée, a shelf full of calf-bound poets, and virginal-looking daybed under its rug of imitation panda fur. How far from this limpid simplicity seemed the palace and the odious council chamber with its unsolvable problems and frightened counselors.